All right, I will say good morning. Let's begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, Dovi and Nina Elman, for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drashos this month in honor of their daughter Ayelet becoming a Bas Mitzvah. They should continue to be a source of nachas for the entire Mishpacha. And our week of learning sponsors, Alan and Sherry Steinmetz, in honor of Allison and Adam Steinmetz's anniversary and all of the Shiurim. Wonderful. We thank all of our sponsors for their generosity and commitment to perpetuating Talmud Torah within our Kehillah. Also, with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Mem Dalid 44. We are picking up on Mem Gimel Amud Beis 43b, and we are picking up 4 lines up from the bottom. Also, really a very interesting sugya today. Says the Gemara, Am Rabbi Avo, Am Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Avo said to Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Yisurin Shabbat Torah, Ein Heter Mitzaref LeIsser. Both say in general, when it comes to Isurim, right? Specifically, we'll illustrate this with Isuri Achila. Let's say we'll see you're not allowed to consume something. In general, the shear for Isuri Achila is a kizayis, right? So let's say again, I can't eat the kizayis of Chazer. But I will say, so what's the halach? In general, we say, Ein Isur Mitzaref Leheter, or Ein Heter Mitzaref LeIsur, I should say, right? That permitted matter does not go ahead and combine with prohibited matter in order to create a shear of Isser. We'll illustrate this in just a moment. For example, actually take a look at Rashi. In Heter Mistaref LeIsser, Rashi says, Achol Chatzi Zayis Chelev Chatzi Zayis Basar. For example, if you ate a half a kizayis of chelev, which is prohibited, with a half a kizayis of meat, which is permitted, bebas achos, and you ate them at once, Ein heter mashlim ashir isra lechaybo. Ultimately, again, the half a kizayis of meat is not going to combine with the half a kizayis of chelev to form a kizayis of isser. That's ein heter mitztaref leisser. So the Gemara says, chutz me yisuri nazir, with one exception. The exception is nazir. Why is Nazir different? Shari Amra Torah Mishras. Because about say when speaking about the Isser of Nazir, the Torah uses Lashon of Mishras. Mishras literally means something that is soaked, or when liquid infuses itself into a solid, as we'll see in just a moment. So we'll say, so what does this mean on a practical level? Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Shari Torah Amra Torah Mishras. Anavim lo yishta chayiv al shrias pito bayayin. So I will say, for example, let's say a nazir goes ahead and soaks a piece of bread in wine, and he then consumes a kizayis of bread. What's going to be the halacha? The halacha is that he's going to be chayiv for wine consumption. Why? Because he consumed, quote unquote, a kizayis of wine. But did he really consume a kizayis of wine? Not really. He consumed less than a kizayis of wine, because obviously some of that kizayis is made up of the bread. But the word mishras, which literally means to soak or to infuse, ultimately tells us that heter mitztaref leisser. That ultimately, again, permitted matter combines with prohibited matter to form the requisite shear. Uziiri amar af sa'ar bal taktiru. So Ziiri says, I will say this is even by karbanas. So about Tatir Bo said the passage that the Gemara is quoting over here is Kol Mincha Shetakrivu LaHashem Lo Sas Sechomitz Ki Kol Se'ar V'Chol Dvash Lo Saktira Menu Yishel LaHashem. But you're not allowed to offer up a carbon that is chometz. So Ziiri says that even if you're not offering up a full kizayis of chometz, but it's only part of a kizayis of chometz, that the isser combines with the heter, ultimately to go ahead and form the requisite shear. Rashi says over here, Af so'ar bal taktiru, nami het mitzaref leiser, chatzi zayis kometz de so'ar, v'chatzi zayis de matzah. So if you have a half a kizayis of chometz, together with half a kizayis of matzah, ultimately they combine to form the shear. So the Gemara says, Kiman, whose opinion does this reflect? Rabbi Eliezer de darshi kol. Both say this is like Rabbi Eliezer who darshins the word kol. Because Rabbi say ultimately, we saw in yesterday's daf, ultimately again Rabbi Eliezer says kol comes to include any form of isser, even if part of it is made up of heter. So we'll say this happens to be this particular discussion of isser mitztar or heter mitztar for isser happens to be a fascinating machlokes. The truth is the real source of it we'll discuss Where does the Gemara call it? I think he quotes it from Nazir, but it's also an interesting sugya in Chulin. Again, but this is the fascinating idea that when you have a unit that is made up of Isser and Heter, do those two things have the ability to combine together to form the requisite shear? So here's what we have. We have Rabbi Yochanan saying, in general, no. In general, no. Heter is not Mistari for Isser. One exception to the rule is Nazir. And the only reason Nazir is an exception is because the Torah uses Lashon of Mishras. Mishras means something soaked. So again, the imagery there that the Gemara is coming up with is bread soaked in wine, which then, bread is mutter, the wine is asr for the Nazir, that then combines to form a shear of Isser. You now have Ze'iri saying that it also refers to karbanos. So the Gemara says, all of this is based on Rabbi Eliezer Hudashin's kol. Top of Mem Dalet. If that's the case, that this is based on the drasha of kol, because we'll say, again, remember, kol is an all-inclusive term that comes to include in this context variant forms of the Isser. If that's the case, le'inyan chametz Pesach nami. So I'll say, why not include chametz on Pesach as well? And tell me that's what? That heter is mitzaref le'isser by chametz bePesach. Now I will say, what would that teach me? That would teach me that halacha l'maisa, if I eat a half a kizayis of matzah combined with a half a kizayis of chametz, that the heter is mitzaref to the isser to form a kizayis of a unit of isser. To which the Gemara says, yeah, you're right. We do paskin heter mitzaref le'isser by chametz as well. V'alafuki medabaye. But only it's not mentioned in order to exclude the position of Abaye. Because what did Abaye say? The Amar Yesh Haktar Lefachos Mekizayis. Because I will say, interestingly enough, Abaye says in general, when it comes to karbanos, even if you go ahead and you offer up less than a kizayis of chametz, you are going to be in violation. Because Abaye holds that even offering less than a kizayis is still a bona fide form of haktara. Kamash malon, the haktara lav lefachos mikizayis. Therefore, I will say the Gemara Dafka focused on the Sa'ar case, on the carbon case, to exclude the position of Abaye. Then halacha l'maisa, if you go ahead and you offer up less than a kizayis of chametz, you are not chayiv for that. But if you were to offer up half a kizayis of chametz, together with half a kizayis of matzah in a sacrificial capacity, then we would say heter mitzaref le'isser, and it would be ki'ilu you offered up a kizayis of chametz. Yosef Rav Dimi v'ka'amar la lahashmaisa. So Rav Dimi said over this ruling, Amar le'abayla Rav Dimi, v'chol yisur shavatorah ein heter mitzaref le'isser. So now, really based on what you're saying, is you're supposed to say, in general, as a general rule, we say, ein heter mitzaref le'isser. Right? In a general sense, we say, right, permitted matter does not go ahead and combine with prohibited matter to form the requisite shear of isser. That's generally what we're saying, right? There are maybe a couple of exceptions, but in general, we hold it's not mitzaref. So the Gemara says, is that true? V'hatanan, listen to this. Hamikva shel truma. So both say, listen to this. Mikvah is like a porridge. So imagine for a moment you have a porridge. The porridge is, or Rashi says any, or like oatmeal, right? Any thick food item. So mikvah shel truma. So you go ahead and you have this porridge that's made of truma. V'hashuma v'hashemen shel chulin. But the garlic and the oil is chulin. So also, which means is, if you could imagine, the porridge is truma, but lemaisa the additives, the ingredients are chulin. So what's the halacha? V'naga tvul yom b'miksasan, and above say tvul yom, which means someone who went to the mikvah that day, but still requires herav shemesh, right? Still requires sunset in order to complete his purification process. So what's the halacha? So v'naga tvul yom b'miksasan, pasal es kulan. The entire porridge becomes pasal. The entire porridge becomes pasal. Then I will say, now why is that? Look at Rashi. Pasal is right across as kala kedera. The mikvah ikar utvul yom pasal as a truma. Because we'll say in this case again, remember it's the porridge that's the ikar. The ingredients or the additives are secondary, and therefore Allah Lamaisa, this porridge has the status of truma. What's the halacha when a tvul yom touches truma? What's the halacha? Becomes pasal, becomes unfit. Good. Next case. Hamikva shel chulin, v'ashem shel truma. What happens if the porridge is chulin, but the garlic and the oil is truma? V'nagal tful yom b'miksasan, and now the tful yom touched one part of the porridge. Lo pasel ela makom ha'ga'ol bilvad. He only pasels mamish the exact area that he touched. Which I will say, this is why they use a porridge case. Because what can you do in a porridge case? What can you do? Just scoop out, right? That's the beauty of porridge. One of the many beauties of porridge, right? You could just go ahead and scoop out the area where the tvul yom touched and just leave the rest. So the Gemara says, Aiva vinan ba. But we asked about this. Makom magao amai psula. I don't understand, why is the area that the tvul yom touched problematic? Habatli luchutavlin barov. Shouldn't the ingredients be batal barov? And I will say, assuming that truma could be batal in some type of shear, right? Salach lemaisa. Why we're not seeing the ingredients? I mean, like the spices, the oil and the garlic. Why isn't that batal barov? V'amra barachana matam. Hoil v'zar loke aleim b'kezayis. Well, so listen to this. And Rabbi Rachana said, I'll tell you why. Because ultimately, again, in case number 2, where the porridge itself is chulin, the garlic and the oil is truma, if a zaref and non-kohen were to go ahead and eat a kezayis of those items, they would get malchus. And I will say, now, what does that mean? Now, before we go on, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, "Va'amra barachana dimua b'daraisahu v'zar loke alav b'kizayis mishum diyesh shem truma ala hilchach legabe tuma nami shem truma ala umiu lo chamira ki truma asma lifsolas kulon umay taima zar loke. Let me just read more line. Zar loke ala b'kizayis mishum zaros halo achal kizayis truma lav mishum dehet misayif listen." I will say, now watch this. So Rabbi Bachana said, why is it that the area where the tvul yom touches becomes tamei? Ultimately, again, because if a non-kohen were to eat it, he would end up ultimately consuming truma, which I will say seems to tell us what? That the way we view this porridge essentially is as truma. As truma, that halacha l'maisa we say heter mitztaref le'isser, and therefore, if a non-kohen were to eat from this porridge, it would be ki'ilu, he would be consuming truma. To which the Gemara says, Hechidami, lav mishum deheter mitztaref le'isser. It must be because at the end of the day, we're saying that the heter mitztaref le'isser, in this case, the heter porridge, is mitztaref to the esser, is to the isser additives, and therefore if a non-kohen were to eat it, he would actually be in violation. Therefore, when the tvul yom touches it, he passes the area where he touched. So the Gemara says, "My lav kizai." I'm sorry. Lo, my hechidami lav mishum de heter mitzaref leiser. Are we not dealing with the case of heter mitzaref leiser? I will say, in which case you begin to see that heter mitzaref leiser does apply to other cases, not just to nazir and not just to karbanos, and not just the chametz, but apparently applies to other cases as well. To which the Gemara says, "Lo, my kizayis." What does it mean that there's a kizayis? Oh, the ika kizayis bichdei achilas pras. Oh, Rabbi say, now we come to an interesting halacha, which is that if you have a prohibited item that's mixed into a permitted item, and technically speaking, you could end up eating a kizayis of iser bichdei achilas pras. So remember again, bichdei achilas pras literally means the amount of time it takes to eat half a loaf. Right? So the Gemara qualifies this. Half a loaf, it's a barley loaf, warm. The Gemara is the whole list. For our purposes, bichdei achilas pras is a certain amount of time. Now there's a machlokes. There's a machlokes in the shir of bichdei achilas pras. How long does it take to eat half a loaf? So both say, this machlokes ranges. Really, in the general spectrum is 3 to 9 minutes, but the truth is you have opinions that even go outside of the 9-minute range. We often utilize this halacha in a situation. So we'll say, before I get to that, the din of kidei achilas pras, anything you eat within that amount of time is considered to be one unified act of eating. So for example, where does this come up all the time for us contemporarily? Yom Kippur. Let's say a person is ill and they have to eat on Yom Kippur. If at all possible, we try to have them space out their eating longer than kedei achilas pras. And the reason we do that is because this way, the eating is not mitzdarif. So if a person eats a little bit now, and a little bit in, let's assume, 5 minutes from now, and a little more 5 minutes after that, those independent acts of eating are not mitzdarif. Masha'in kain, or don't combine to form one act. Masha'in kain, if a person eats a little bit now, another little bit in a minute from now, another little bit in a minute from now, all of those smaller acts combine into one comprehensive halachic act of eating. Shabbos says, so what the Gemara is suggesting over here is the reason why the porridge is problematic, even though the porridge is chulin, and it's only the garlic and the oil that's truma, because what's the case? The nature or the ratio of the garlic and the oil is such that when you end up eating porridge, you'll end up consuming a kezayis of truma, bichdei achilas pras. So if you eat porridge, let's just choose right now in the spectrum of 3 to 9, 5 minutes. If you eat porridge for 5 minutes, what's going to end up happening? Effectively, what happens? You've consumed a kezayis of truma. That's why the mixture is problematic. So the Gemara says, ukzayis bichdei achilas pras daraisa. And is this concept of consuming a kezayis bichdei achilas pras, is that d'oraisa? Amar le'in. And he said, yes, in fact it is. In fact it is. I will say, the notion of kezayis, so we'll say, so this is incredibly important. So we'll say, so again, what the Gemara is suggesting is the problematic situation with the porridge case, even when the porridge is chulin, and it's only the oil and the garlic that's truma, is that if you continuously eat this porridge, you will end up consuming a kezayis of truma ingredients, bichdei achilas pras, within the amount of time in which your independent acts of eating are mitzdarif into, or combined into one comprehensive act of eating. If that's the case, if that's the case, ultimately again, why do the Rabbanan argue on Rabbi Lazar? By kusach. See, I will say, remember again, the Rabbanan said, because going back to yesterday's daf, look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, Amai pligi Rabbanan li Rabbi Lazar kusach, nehi nami delo darshi kol Rabbi Seruvo, ha'achil miha mi isra kezayis b'dei achilas pras. Remember again, in yesterday's daf, we're talking about is kusach asr or not, right, on Pesach. And the issue was, do you hold that ta'aroves chametz, a mixture of chametz, ultimately is asr? But one second. We'll say, if you eat kusach, what inevitably happens? What inevitably happens? If you eat kusach for 3 minutes straight, we'll say, what occurs? Right? You have consumed the kizayis of bread. Now, if you just tell me that eating kizayis bichdei achilas pras is a din da'oraisa, so why do the Rabbanan argue on Rabbi Eliezer by kusach? Everyone should agree that kusach is prohibited. Whether you hold that ta'aroves chametz, a mixture of chametz, is asr or not, if you hold that the concept of a consumption of kizayis over a span of time of kedei achilas pras, the amount of time it takes to eat half a loaf, that anything you eat in that time span combines to form one comprehensive act of eating, then halacha l'maisa kusach shabi aser. To which the Gemara says, Elamai, Elamai mishum deheter mitztarif le'isr. Because you will say no, because there at the end of the day, it could be that it's an issue of heter mitzdarif le'isr. That halacha l'maisa, again, do we say in the case of kusach, as you're consuming the kusach, halacha l'maisa, does the heter part of the kusach combine with the isr? To which the Gemara says, sof. Still, why do they argue at the end of the kusach habavli? Elahanach l'kusach habavli. Very interesting, I will say. To which the Gemara says, you're wrong, your premise is wrong. If you consume kusach continuously for 3 minutes, there's no kezayis b'dei achilas pras. Now, both, and I watch this. The Gemara says, but that's not true. That's not true. It's if you eat kusach continuously, there is a kezayis b'dei achilas pras. What does Rabbi say? Watch this. It could remember what is kusach. Rabbi say, how was kusach used? It was a dip. So watch this. The Gemara says, "I be'enei v'kasharif v'ka'achalei batla daita eitzel koladam." Because they will say, if you gulp kusach, Enachinami. If you gulp kusach, so then enachinami, you will end up consuming kizayis b'tei achilas pras. We'll say, what's the problem with gulping kusach? What's the problem? No one eats it that way. So we'll say, remember again, non-normative consumption in general won't make you chayiv. Won't make you chayiv. So therefore, if you go ahead and you gulp kusach, while it is true, you have consumed a kizayis of bread, b'chdei achilas pras, that's non-normative consumption. So because it's non-normative consumption, therefore halacha l'maisa, what we call batla daito itzel koladam. What you're doing is non-normative, and because it's non-normative, it doesn't show up on the halachic radar, so to speak. The mishtar kashatir ve'achil, and we'll say, but if you use kusach normally, which is what? As a dip. You dip into it and you eat it like that. Less bake kizayis b'chtei achilas pras. We'll say then halacha l'maisa, under those circumstances, there is no kizayis b'chtei achilas pras. Good. So we'll say, so just want to point out now, the Gemara is advancing two halachic concepts. One is heter mitzdarif le'iser, right? And I will say that's subject to machlokes. It sounds like what the Gemara is saying right now is in general, we don't say heter mitzdarif le'iser to form a shir of iser. That permitted substance does not combine with prohibited substance to form a shir of iser for the prohibited substance, with the exceptions of nazir, karbanos, and maybe chametz on Pesach. That's concept number one. Concept number two, Abba say, is kizayis b'chtei achilas pras. Now, it seems to be now, at this point in the Gemara, no one's arguing on that. That halacha l'maisa, and Abba say this is incredibly important, because we're often conditioned to thinking about isuri achila as you just consume it. But what halacha is teaching is that no, if I end up eating a kizayis of iser over a span of time, as long as that span of time is within kidei achilas pras, then my act of eating is looked at halachically as one unified act. So it says Gemara Esvei Shtei Kederos Achal Shel Chulin VaAchal Shel Truma. We'll say if I have two pots of food, one of Chulin and one of Truma, V'lifnei and Shtei Maduchos Achal Shel Chulin VaAchal Shel Truma, and in front of the pots I have two maduchos. So we'll say a maducha literally is a press, right? Is a press or a mill. So Rashi points out to her it's for making spices. So I have like could be a mortar and a pestle. Also, I have a grinder where I go and I process spices. And what happens? Achal shel chulin va'achal shel truma. And one is of chulin, one is of truma. V'naflu eilu l'sochela. So we'll say, we actually had this case earlier. So I have two pots of food, one chulin, one truma, and in front of the two pots are two spice grinders, right? One has truma spices, one has chulin spices. So what happened? V'naflu eilu l'sochela. Now we'll say, here's what I know. The spices were added to the pots of food. What don't I know? Which spices were put in which pots? So the Gemara says, eilu mutarin. Right? I'm sorry, elu mutarin. Why? Everything is mutar. Shani omer truma l'soch. Truma nafla, v'chulin l'soch, chulin naflu. Because I assume the chulin spices went into the chulin pot, and the truma spices went into the truma pot. But one second. The amrit kizayis b'tei achilas pras da'oraisa. Amai amrinan. Shani omer truma l'soch. But I don't understand. If you hold, or both saying, that kizayis b'tei achilas pras is problematic, then it's possible that maybe the truma spices fell into the chulin pot, and now when I eat the chulin food, I may end up eating a kizayis of truma spices b'chdei achilas pras, and that's problematic. That's illegal consumption of truma. So what right do I? So I understand if you tell me that the spices are batal, although I will say, interestingly enough, the issue of bittul when it comes to spices is not such a pashut thing, because anything that gives recognizable flavor often in halacha is not batal. But again, we're not going to get into that right now. But the point the Gemara is making over here is that halacha l'maisa, if you hold that kizayis b'chtei achilas pras is asar, then why can I just make the assumption that chulin fell into chulin, truma fell into chulin, truma fell into truma, maybe truma fell into chulin, truma spices fell into chulin food, and now when I eat the chulin food, I'm going to end up eating kizayis of truma spices b'chtei achilas pras? To which the Gemara says, no. Amalei hanach l'trumas tavlin dirabanan. The reason we don't get all excited in this case, also over here, is why? Because this is a suffix dirabanan, right? How so? Because they're both saying, it's only midaraisa, you don't have to tithe spices. right? There's no such thing as truma spices. It's only midrabanan that ultimately, again, there's an obligation to go ahead and take truma from spices. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says, last line, Elahanach l'trumas tavlin d'midrabanan dereshis degancha sirosh chavitz harecha ksiv. Because I will say, at the end of the day, the Torah, when it speaks about truma, says it has to be the rashis of your grain, of your wheat, right, and of your olives, and of your grapes. So you see, spices are not biblically subject to truma, therefore it's only derabanan. Because it's derabanan, that's why we're mekel, and we assume truma fell into truma, chulin fell into chulin. Says the Gemara, I'm sorry. Lost the place. Esvei. So also we asked another kasha. Esvei. Shtei kupos. Acha shachulin v'acha shal truma. V'lifneim beis si'in. Acha shachulin v'acha truma. It's another similar case. Let's say I have two kupos, right? Two baskets. One filled with chulin, one filled with truma. And in front of them, again, beis si'in. Both say there are two, now sa'az are usually a dry measure. Two more dry measures, right? One of chulin, one of truma. So both say, if you can imagine, you have two baskets of grain. And in front of the two larger baskets of grain, you have two smaller baskets of grain. One of chulin, one of truma. V'naflu elu soch elu. And again, I both say the two smaller baskets are emptied into the two larger ones. Mutarin, everything is mutar. Why? Shani omer chulin l'soch chulin naflu, truma l'soch truma nafla. Because I assume chulin went into chulin, truma went into truma. Same case. Vi amrit kizayis b'tei achilas pras daraisa ma'ay amrina shani omer. But I don't understand. If kizayis b'tei achilas pras is really aser midaraisa, how can you assume chulin into chulin, truma into truma? Maybe the truma fell into the chulin, and halacha l'maisa, now when I consume it, I'm going to end up eating a kizayis of truma b'tei achilas pras. To which the Gemara says, Shani Omer, so the Gemara says, Amrlei, Hanach l'truma bizman hazeh, derabanan. Because Rabbi said this case is talking as a contemporary case, without a Beis HaMikdash, and truma bizman hazeh is derabanan. Therefore, halacha l'maisi can be mekel. Okay, good. So we'll say, so in both of those cases, what the Gemara is just pointing out is we're dealing with dinei derabanan, and since you're dealing with a suffix in a derabanan, you can be mekel. Good. So v'hai mishras l'achiyuda. So we'll say now the Gemara goes all the way back. So remember again, we got before we got into kizayis b'tei achilas pras, we got into what? Heter mitztaref le'isser. This interesting idea that something permitted could combine with something prohibited, ultimately to create the requisite shear for isser. And the example or the source that the Gemara says was mishras. Mishras. The Torah says the Nazir can't eat something which was soaked. So he said, what's that case? We'll say that case is where you take a permitted piece of bread and you soak it in wine. And then the Nazir consumes a kizayis. Now we'll say, now when the Nazir consumes a kizayis of bread-soaked wine, right, or wine-soaked bread. Yeah, wine-soaked bread. So also now when the Nazir eats a kizayis of wine-soaked bread, is he consuming a kizayis of wine? No, maybe a lot of it is wine, but some of it is certainly bread, and yet you see that's aser. The Gemara is saying that's the source for the concept of hefter mitztaref le'isser. So the Gemara says, 1 second, v'hai mishras l'achiyuda asa. Is mishras? So both say, is that word? Is that available? Is that really? Do we use it to teach us hefter mitztaref le'isser? We need that word to teach us something else. Haimi b'ayde l'chidisanya. I need that for another limud. Mishras, the word mishras teaches me Amud Beis litain tam ki'ikr. Wow, Rabbi said this is very interesting. Mishras teaches me the concept of tam ki'ikr. Rabbi say this is incredible. Tam ki'ikr means that in halacha, the taste of something or the flavor of something is the equivalent of the solid mass of the item as well. The taste of a prohibited item is just as usher as the physical prohibited item as well. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Litain tam ki'ikr, lasos tamo shal iser. The taste, the flavor of something that is usher is just as usher ki'ikaro umamasho. Is just as usher ultimately again as the actual physical item itself. For both sides, we're getting some major concepts today. It's going to be a good week when it's only Monday. And Mam Shabbos say again, you understand what's happening over? We've got Heter Mistarei Fil Isser, we've got Kizayis V'Dei Achilas Pras, and now Tam Ki'ikr. So Shabbos say Tam Ki'ikr again. So the Gemara says Mishras teaches me Tam Ki'ikr, meaning what? Shimshara Anavim B'Mayim V'Yesh B'Em Tam Yayin Chayiv. They will say, what does Mishras teach me? That if a Nazir soaks grapes in water and then removes the grapes from the water and drinks the grape-flavored water, what's the halacha? He's chayiv. He's chayiv. The Rabbi say, 1 second, why is he chayiv? Are there any grapes in the water? Are there any grapes in the water? No. What do you have? The only thing you have is what? Tam. There's flavor. But Mishras teaches me that even grape flavor, wine flavor is going to be problematic. So we'll say, here you see, Tam Ki'ikr. That ultimately, again, the tam, the taste, or the flavor of an item is the equivalent of the actual physical presence of the item itself. Incredible. Mikana tadan lekola Torah kula. And I will say, ultimately, again, from here, we take the concept that we learned by Nazir, and we apply it to Kala Torah Kula. The concept of Tam Ki'ikr applies to Kala Torah Kula. So we'll say, watch this. Uman Nazir. So now we'll say, now how do I know to apply it to Kala Torah Kula? I'll tell you why. Uman Nazir, She'ein Isuro Isur Olam. So we'll say, if by Nazir is not an eternal prohibition. Right? So let's remember again, Stam Neder Nazir says how long? Let's say a person says, Harini Nazir. How long does it become a Nazir for? 30 days, right? Stam Neder Nazir Salam and Yom. And in general, again, I will say, aside from what we call Nazir Shimshon, where a person becomes a Nazir for their whole life, that's not how Neder Naziris usually works. It's usually a timed, right, or we'll call it a neder of limited duration. Suma Nazir Sheni Suro Isser Olam. Nazir is not an eternal prohibition. Ve'ein Isuro Isser Hana. And also remember again, the Nazir's Isser, legabe grapes and wine, is only an Isser of consumption, not an Isser of Hana. So a Nazir is permitted to get Hana, ultimately again from grapes and wine. V'yesh heter li Isuro. And ultimately again, and yesh heter, and Rabbi say, there is the ability for him, for that which is Asr to become permitted. Now Rashi points out over here, yesh heter li Isuro means that technically speaking, he could have his neder nazirus annulled. Annulled. That's right? Shabbos says, number one, it's not eternal. Right? Not eternal, it's timed. Number two, even during the actual time of this, you could have it annulled. Number three, it's not an Isra no. And yet we say what? Asa bo tam ki'ikr. And yet we see that halacha l'maisa, tam ki'ikr, that by Nazir we learn the concept that flavor is the equivalent of the actual physical item itself. So we'll say if that applies by Nazir, it certainly will apply in more severe prohibitions. For example, kilayim. Right? We'll say kilayim are forbidden mixtures. Sheisuro isra olam. Now remember, kilayim are forbidden forever. Visuro isra hana. You can't get hana from kilayim. Ve'ein heter li isuro. And ultimately, again, there is no way to go ahead and get any benefit, or there is no way, I should say, to go ahead and permit kilayim. Eino din shiyase tam ki'ikr. Then of course we should say tam ki'ikr. As we'll say, so if tam ki'ikr is going to apply in a relatively, we'll call it, more kal isser, like nazir, it'll certainly apply in a more chamer form of isser, like kilayim. And the Gemara said, v'adin la'arla b'shtayim. And arla is the same thing as kilayim on 2 counts. Right? In other words, I will say in that, remember, arla, the only difference between arla and kilayim is that whereas kilayim is asa forever, ultimately, again, arla is not asa forever, because after 3, arla is only asa for 3 years. But Allah Chalamaisiyin, after 3 years, the fruit of the tree is permitted. So I will say, the Gemara is Hamani, so whose opinion is this? Rabbanan, this reflects the view of the Rabbanan. For Rabbi Yochanan Damak Rabbi Akiva, but Rabbi Yochanan ultimately again holds like Rabbi Akiva. So both say, so remember again, all the Gemara just pointing out is that halacha l'maisa, there's a machlokes. What's the machlokes? How do you darshan the word mishras? That's the machlokes. So ultimately again, the Gemara says that this opinion over here, who holds that mishras teaches me tam ke'ikr, That's the Rabbanon. But Rabbi Yochanan, who was quoted again on Mem Gimel Amud Beis, Rabbi Yochanan is the one who quoted Rabbi Akiva as saying that Halacha L'Maisa Mishras teaches me that Heter Mitzdaref L'Isser. So I said, this is really quite fascinating. So from one word, by Nazir, we have a machlokes as to what you do with it. Right? That it's just a fundamental machlokes. You have one opinion saying Rabbi Yochanan, the name of Rabbi Akiva, ultimately telling me, or I should say, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Akiva telling me that Mishras teaches me Heter Mitzdaref L'Isser. Permitted item combined with a prohibited item, ultimately to go ahead and create a shir of Isser. And now here I have the Rabbanan saying, no, Mishras teaches me Tam Ki'ikar. That flavor is the equivalent, ultimately, again, of the actual mamashos, physicality of the item. So the Gemara says, hey Rabbi Akiva. Now which Rabbi Akiva are we referring to? Now watch this. Ilem Rabbi Akiva Dimas Nisin. If you want to say it's Rabbi Akiva of the Mishnah, Disnan Rabbi Akiva Omer, Nazir Sheshara Pito B'Yayin. So we'll say ultimately again, if a Nazir went ahead and he soaked a piece of bread in wine, V'yesh bo litzaref kedei kizayis chayiv. Ultimately again, and there is enough to combine to form a shir of kizayis. Ultimately, the Nazir is chayiv. So the Gemara says, Umi mai dimi pas umiyan. I will say, now how do you know that the kizayis being mentioned over here is a combination of wine and bread? Maybe dilma miyayin lichudei. Maybe ultimately again there's enough wine by itself. In other words, maybe there's just a kizayis of wine. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, but maybe you'll say, one second, if there's just a kizayis of wine by itself, then what is there to say? Or as we both say, if let's say I'm soaking a piece of bread in the wine, and there's a kizayis of wine right there by itself, now it's calling it, remember I'll say, I know you think it to yourself, kizayis of wine, normally again I will say, we would assume, how would you measure wine? A revius, but remember again, the wine is being soaked up in a solid item. So therefore, again, once it's soaked up in a solid, it's going to convert to a kizayis. So maybe you'll say that there's a kizayis of wine independent of the bread. But if there's a kizayis of wine independent of the bread, ma'ila memra, then what is there to say? Ha kamash malon da'af al gav de ta'aroves. So I will say, no, you might have said the chiddush still is, there's a mixture. See, I might have thought that maybe the Nazir is only chayiv for wine consumption when it's just pure wine. But once the wine is mixed in with something else, maybe halacha l'maisa again, things become more complicated. Kamash malon, el Rabbi Akiva de Braisa. Rather, Rabbi say the Rabbi Akiva of Heter Mitzdaref L'Isra learned out from Mishras is Rabbi Akiva in the Braisa. This Sanya, here we go. Nazir, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Nazir sheshara pito beyayin. If a Nazir soaked his bread in wine, va'achal kizayis mipas umiyayin, and then the Nazir goes ahead and drinks a combination, or I should say the Nazir consumes a combination of bread and wine, chayiv. I suppose say this is quite explicit. So this is Rabbi Akiva. Shitas Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva learns out from the word mishras, that mishras means if you have a piece of bread soaked in wine, and halacha l'mais again, you consume it, and the kizayis you consume is a combination of bread and wine together, halacha l'mais, those are mitzdaref. So from here you see that heter mitzdaref le'isser, permitted substance could combine with prohibited substance to form a shir of isser. And where does Rabbi Akiva learn this out from? Mishras. But I will say if that's the case, that Rabbi Akiva is using Mishras to teach us heter mitzdaref le'isser, then I have a kasha. What's the kasha? Rabbi Akiva, tam ki'ikr minale. Where does Rabbi Akiva learn out tam ki'ikr? Right, I will say, remember again, it's not from Mishras. So where does Rabbi Akiva learn out that flavor is the equivalent of the actual physicality of the item? Listen to this, this is great. Yalif lei, minale, yalif mi basar b'chalav. Wow. He learns it from basar b'chalav. Basar b'chalav, because I will say, what happens to basar b'chalav? Lav taima ba'almahu va'asar. I will say, when you cook meat and milk together, what's the status of that mixture, right? That you cook meat in a pot of milk. So I'll say, now what happens? You go ahead and you take out the piece of meat. And let's say you wring the piece of meat out. There's no milk left in it. What's the status of the meat? Asr. Why? Because again, we assume that the flavor of the milk is there. but it's only flavor. You see from basar b'chalav tam ki'ikr. Rabbi Akiva will say that halacha l'maisa flavor is tantamount to the actual physical presence of the item itself. To which the Gemara says, Yolei mi basar b'chalav lav time ba'amu v'asar hachanami loshna. Shavuot say interesting enough. Shavuot says, I just want to point out. So Rabbi Akiva uses mishras to teach that heter mitzaref le'isr. In which case, again, obviously, then Mishras is not available to teach Tam Ki'ikr. So from where will Rabbi Akiva learn out Tam Ki'ikr? Halacha l'maaseh, he will learn it out from Basar B'chalav. V'Rabbanan, Basar B'chalav lo gamrinim d'chidushu. So both say, why don't the Rabbanan learn out Tam Ki'ikr from Basar B'chalav? In other words, the Rabbanan learn out Tam Ki'ikr from Mishras. But why learn it out from Mishras? Learn it out from Basar B'chalav. Listen to this. You can't learn Basar B'chalav because Basar B'chalav is a chiddush. What's the chiddush? Ilema dahai lichudei v'hai lichudei shari ubahadi hadadi asar. Maybe you want to say, well, no. The chiddush of Basar B'chalav, Rabbi say, is that two independently permitted items, when combined, become aser, which Rabbi say is a pretty big chiddush. Remember, again, I want to point out, basar b'chalav only applies to kosher meat and kosher milk. It's very important, right? So each independent item by themselves is totally mutter. Then somehow, when you combine them together, they become aser. So maybe because basar b'chalav is such a chiddush, it can't be used as a source for other items. Or in other words, the halacha can't be used as a source for something else. The Gemara says, "Kilayim nami hayluchudei v'hayluchudei shari ubahadadi aser." In general, the Gemara is going to say, actually, in the realm of forbidden mixtures, interestingly enough, forbidden mixtures seem to follow this basic paradigm. Because think about kilayim. So what's kilayim? What's kilayim? Wheat, right? Let's say you have wheat and vines, right, and grapes. So each item by itself is totally permitted. Only once you mix them together do they become prohibited. Ella di tarles, rather Rabbanan see like this. I'll tell you why I can't learn out from Basar B'chalav. Ella di tarle kuliyom b'chal b'shari. Well, this is actually very interesting. If you were to soak meat in milk the whole day, without fire, just go ahead and soak meat in a bowl of milk, right? Ultimately, again, the meat would be totally permitted. Yet, bashuli aser, once you cook it, it becomes prohibited. So the Rabbanan say, essentially, you can't learn out Tam Ki'ikr from Basar B'chalav, because Basar B'chalav is a chiddush. You could soak meat in milk the entire day and it's totally permitted, yet it's only once you go out and you cook it that it becomes ready. I'll just tell you, halacha l'maisa, there is a concept that when you soak a solid in a liquid for more than 24 hours, there's a concept of kavash kamavushal, that ultimately, again, allowing a solid to remain in a liquid for more than 24 hours affects a quasi-cooking process. But again, less than 24 hours, it's not going to be problematic. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva, nami basar b'chalav v'adai chidushu. So ultimately, Rabbi Akiva will agree, yes, it is true. Basar b'chalav is a chiddush. Ela yalif migi ulei nachrim. But rather again, we can learn it out ultimately from the case of gi'ulei nachrim. So, you know what we'll do? We'll stop over here for today. We'll stop with this. So, I'm just pointing out. So let's just review what we have in the minute that we have left. So, in the minutes we have left, we essentially have a machlokis over here now in drashas, right? Focusing now on the drasha of mishras. What do I do with mishras? Rabbi Akiva says, Mishras teaches me, heter mitzaref le'isr. The Rabbanan say, Mishras teaches me, tam ki'ikr. So fine, no problem there, except, where does Rabbi Akiva learn out tam ki'ikr? That's what we're trying to figure out now. It's not going to be from Mishras. Rabbi say, it appears that Rabbi Akiva learns out from Basar B'chalav. From Basar B'chalav, which is a good place to say tam ki'ikr, to which the Gemara says, but the problem with Basar B'chalav is that Basar B'chalav is such a unique halacha, to which the Gemara is then going to continue. We'll pick up with it tomorrow, that Rabbi Akiva teaches us that perhaps we learn it out from gi'ulei nachrim. The fact that if you go out and you acquire utensils from Gentiles, that halacha l'maisa you have to kasher. Now, why do you have to kasher? Because at the end of the day, there are absorptions, but those are just absorptions. They're just tam. So if it's just tam, why is it a problem? Oh, you see from here, tam kicker. So we'll stop over for today. We'll pick up Emirat Hashem with Gi'ulei Nachrim tomorrow. Shkach Havosai.
Tam kicker also applying to fake tam?
What do you mean?
Something that's like a chemical.
Yeah. If it's usher, so don't remember, Tam Kikar only poses a problem in a situation of Isser. So, yeah, if